And we are live. Excellent. Hello, everybody. It's Monday night. I'm coming from you from this little bungalow in Queens. That's kind of nice, but I'm all over the place in this episode. So like we had to pre-record the interview that we're going to have later, and it's going to be at a different location. But hey, my life's a mess. The world's a mess. So just trying to fit the vibe of the current degrading geopolitical security situation. So what happened this weekend as we're all clambering into the live? So we had a bombing. Israel bombed Yemen. So that's probably going to de-escalate. Yemen responded. If you guys were completely unplugged since Friday, Yemen with a unmanned suicide drone penetrated Israel's air defense grid and hit Tel Aviv. They responded by bombing a port, fuel depot at a port in Yemen. At least 19 people were killed. The Houthis responded by shooting one, potentially more than one. There's been conflicting reports of ballistic missiles at the port of Eilat in southern Israel, and they were intercepted by the David sling system, which is for bigger missiles and bigger threats than the Iron Dome. So am I in Rockaway? I am not in Rockaway Park right now. Anyways, that happened. It's probably going to de-escalate because nobody wants a bombing campaign. And, Israel has proven that its air defense systems are not up to snuff to keep the country completely safe. They don't want to get bombed. Yemen doesn't want to get bombed. We're looking at a de-escalation. So that's that one news story. I've been wrong before, but I definitely don't think I've been wrong with this. Iran also does not want this situation to escalate. They're achieving all of their political objectives just by letting everything play out. And we're going to bring the ICJ ruling opinion that came out Friday. That's the main focus of this episode here in a minute. Also, Joe Biden no longer going to be president. I mean, he most likely, he wasn't going to be president anyways, but now he's definitely not. So he's endorsing Kamala Harris. The billionaire class in America that Joe Biden has served faithfully for over 47 years has finally pulled the plug on his campaign. Over 60 billionaires have come out around 60 billionaires, have come out and openly endorsed Trump. If you're on the bathroom wall at a dive bar, that is X, formerly known as Twitter, Elon Musk is totally pushing on his own personal platform, why Trump would be such a great president. So we have four years to look forward to that guy. Just mentally prepare yourself, psychically, emotionally, spiritually prepare yourself for all the consequences that will come out of that. Also, one more new before we jump into the main segment. Kamala Harris, she's declined to preside over Benjamin Netanyahu apparently speaking in front of Congress on Wednesday. If you're in the DC area, swing by. I'm going to be there on the ground covering that, and should get pretty interesting. So yes, there is going to be a massive action against Benjamin Netanyahu coming to speak to our Congress, especially when he has requested ICC warrants out for him for crimes against humanity. So anyways, now let's get started with international law, because on Friday the ICJ, in a case that is separate from what happened with the South African genocide case in front of the ICJ. This predates October 7th. This has been in the works for years, and it came after the referral to the UN General Assembly has ruled that Israel is, in fact, an occupational apartheid government, and they are trying to permanently annex through illegal settlements Palestinian territory. So, let's play some clips from the actual press release. Oh, wait.
Broad array of legislation adopted and measures taken by Israel in its capacity as an occupying power treat Palestinians differently on grounds specified by international law. The court notes that this differentiation of treatment cannot be justified with reference to reasonable and objective criteria, nor to a legitimate public aim. Accordingly, the Court is of the view that the regime of comprehensive restrictions imposed by Israel on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes systematic discrimination based on inter-area race, religion, or ethnic origin in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and 26 of the ICCPR, Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the ICESCR, and Article 2 of CERD.
Okay, yeah. So pessimism, about the effectiveness and enforcement of international law and the concept of a rules-based order is understandable, but not all hope is lost yet. It is unsurprising that mainstream media have largely ignored this historic and unprecedented ruling of the International Court of Justice against Israel's apartheid and illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. According to an analysis by Haaretz, this ruling, quote, essentially arms countries with justification, institutions, corporations with justifications to penalize Israel. So if we were going to pull up, just so you can see how internally Israeli media is treating this, it's pretty significant. So yes, scrolling up, you can see the title of their analysis is actually is ICJ's decision on occupation goes beyond Israel's worst fears. So you can check out that article if you want. It's basically, look, Prime Minister Netanyahu has focused much of his career on opposing the Oslo Accords, which we're going to get into with our guest is a lawyer of international humanitarian law. He's made it his whole career to torch the Oslo Accords. That's been his main talking point. But now, because of this ruling, the Oslo Accords are effectively nullified, but not in the way he intended. Israel is no longer in a position to condescend to allow Palestinians the right to self-determination. Instead, they are now compelled to do so unconditionally, according to the highest legal authority in the world. So if Israel fails to end the occupation, which is obviously they're not going to do it, there are now legal mechanisms in place to pressure it to comply. So this is, if we look at what happened to South Africa, this is kind of like a major ruling in the beginning of the end. And the beginning of the end will last years. So there was, we're not going to see effects of this immediately. So there was this massive misinformation push immediately following the World Court's ruling on Friday, with propagandists on social media characterizing it as an opinion and emphasizing the term non-binding. But what they mean legally is it's different from what you would use as an opinion in your everyday life. And we're going to get into that later as well. So this is, of course, a mischaracterization of the nature of international law meant to pacify the layman. So if we're going to look at the Israeli Foreign Ministry's response, I'm pulling that up right now because they do a lot of their communication on Twitter. This is kind of what they said. Everything they brought up here is not actually enforced, has nothing to do with international law. So one of their main statements was, it should be clarified that the opinion that published today is an advisory opinion. It is not legally binding. This is obviously a mischaracterization, as I said previously. The state of Israel adheres to the rule of law and has an independent and respected legal system. It is committed to international law and will continue to protect its citizens in accordance with international law. But what it fails to mention, oh yes, I do mean X. Sorry, Smokey. Thanks. I just hate the name, so I keep the old name. But anyways, what it fails to mention is that the World Court has determined Israel is guilty of apartheid with institutionally discriminatory legal systems against Palestinians. Consequently, Israel is no longer considered an independent and respected legal system capable of investigating itself. The long-term implications of this ruling extend beyond Israel's worst fears. And we can gauge the significance of this ruling by the mainstream media's response, which has been minimal, mainly just highlighting that it's not legally binding. And although this is true, the ruling sets a clear precedent that will be referenced for years to come, and it does not reflect positively on the situation. So this is a legal matter, and of course will not immediately impact the daily lives and lived experience of Palestinians living under military occupation in the West Bank or those in Gaza. now enduring what the IDF calls another assault into a safe zone. Because, oh, yeah, of course, right after the ICJ rules that, they need to end the occupation and apartheid, what do? They assault another safe zone. So, nothing new there. So despite the dire situation, there is a glimmer of hope. The ruling finally addressed the issue of reparations, providing clarity that many legal scholars did not expect at this stage. They saw the question of reparations being like years down the line, but it's already happening right now. So we're going to explore the significance of this development with Kristen Zornada, an international humanitarian lawyer and federal judicial advisor. So real quick, before we begin the interview, I have to remind y'all that we are an independent newsroom here at Mint Press, and we rely heavily on outside non-corporate contributions. So if you want to check us out on Patreon, that'd be great. And we're just going to jump right in to the discussion about this historic ruling. Stand by. Here we go. So tonight on State of Play, in order to help us clarify some state-sponsored legal misinformation, we are joined by Kristen Zornada, an Australian-Italian lawyer with a master's in human rights law and humanitarian law, aka the law of war, from Harvard University. She has been active as a legal advisor on human rights issues affecting Palestine for nearly a decade after a trip to the West Bank. Funny how that's a trend, huh? So Kristen has worked for the UN in Cambodia, prosecuting former Khmer Rouge leaders for genocide and crimes against humanity, advised federal senators on human rights implications of proposed legislation, and as a clerk for Justice Melissa Perry of the federal court. So she has a number of publications in the Harvard Law Record. Thank you so much for coming on. I know the Australian-American time difference is a total pain, so we appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
So before this segment, we were talking about how the media is pretty ignorant, willfully or otherwise, about international law. And so before we dive into the specifics of this case, what are the main misperceptions? We have the ICJ, we have the ICC, we have the South Africa case, we have this case. What do you think is important for everybody to know going into this?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's important for people to know is that the International Court of Justice is a different institution to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is the institution which is established by the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute is an instrument to which the United States and Israel are not parties. So they haven't signed on to that. They don't agree to be part of the court's, subject to the court's jurisdiction. The ICJ is a different matter. The ICJ is established by the UN Charter, which means that the ICJ binds all members of the United Nations. It is a UN organ. That means that if you are a state party to the UN, then you are bound by the ICJ. So the question that I often get is, well, isn't Israel and the United States not subject to the ICJ? And no, the answer is they are. As UN member states, they have responsibilities to carry out what is required of them by the International Court of Justice. The ICC is a different matter, but that's not what we're going to be focusing on today. We're talking about the ICJ. Now, the ICJ itself has two sort of modes, I guess. They have an advisory mode where they can be asked for an opinion by the Security Council or a state on a legal issue. So, do you think that this particular issue is a violation of international law? Compared to what's called its adversarial jurisdiction or contentious jurisdiction, where you have two states or more that have an issue with each other and they're actually acting as an arbitrator, and they actually say, okay, no, you're right here, you're wrong, and this is what you have to do. So what this case is in the advisory jurisdiction, which means it's just advice. So it's not deciding a dispute for the parties, whereas the South African case is actually asking the ICJ in its contentious jurisdiction, can you decide for us whether or not the Genocide Convention applies and if these mechanisms will apply? So consider this more of a consultation, or, as if they were getting consultation from the best and brightest international lawyers, obviously, who are on the International Court of Justice. And that said, because it is an opinion of the International Court of Justice, even though it is not a contentious opinion and it's non-binding, as it were, it still obviously has a lot of gravitas because it's an international legal opinion.
Right, and I think that's an important distinction. I've seen some posts on social media equating this to the South African trial. This is distinct because this came at the request of the United Nations.
So this was instituted by the Palestinian Authority, but yes, it comes through the United Nations, and that's important, as I mentioned before, because its decisions are binding on all member states of the United Nations. So unlike with the ICC arrest warrants, the United States and Israel can't say here, oh, well, we don't submit to it. Well, unfortunately, you're in the United Nations, so you do.
Right. And so, first of all, now that we've established that, just reading the official response of the Israeli Foreign Ministry to the ICJ ruling, which I touched on in the intro of this episode, it seems that this is just an opinion. These are the words that they focus on. It's an opinion. It is non-binding. It is advisory. It lacks any legal teeth or coercive force. I'm hoping you could explain to us why and how that this is not necessarily true. There are ramifications, and this does have weight.
Sure. I mean, this is a very typical response from the Israeli government, and it parallels the responses that you see from the US government on this issue. And it's not a coincidence because both the US and Israel are engaged in a campaign of lawfare. And lawfare, basically in simple terms, is the delegitimization of international law and the misappropriation and mischaracterization of it in order to suit political goals that are basically imperialism. And what basically the strategy is that, one, international law isn't real. If it is real, it doesn't apply. If it does apply, it doesn't apply to us. And if it does apply to us, we haven't broken it. And if we have broken it, well, you can't stop us anyway. So basically, you can sort of put Israel's responses to international law developments in one of those categories. It's somewhere in there. And this is definitely in the category of, well, we haven't, doesn't apply to us, and it even if it did, you can't stop us. So it's all part of it. We have to recognize it's all part of an overall pattern of trying to delegitimize international law. It's not actually an accurate characterization. And if we can focus on what you said specifically about it's non-binding, it's advisory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting they say that, because if you go back to the press release that you mentioned, they talk about how, this stands in the way of negotiations. It stands in the way of the parties deciding what's best for them. Well, okay, if it's an advisory opinion, it's not binding, then how does it obstruct those negotiations at all? If it's not making a decision for the parties, if it's as non-binding as they say it is, if it's advisory, if it doesn't create any obligations, how could it possibly obstruct any negotiations to peace between the parties? Because they're not ordering anything, right? They're just clarifying the law. And the biggest issue here is, I think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, and he talks about the whole aim of nonviolence is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it forces the oppressor to the table, on just terms. And that's what this is doing. And that's what Israel is really scared of, is not that this is obstructing efforts to peace. It's that it's leveling the playing ground. Because until now, they've been able to smoke and mirrors international law. They've been able to say it's not a genocide. It's not a genocide. It's not an occupation. It's not apartheid. And now the international legal community are saying, yes, it is. Actually, it is all of those things. And when you think about the role of court proceedings, non-binding, etc., that's not really the point. If the purpose is negotiations, which it always has been, the purpose of the law is to sort of clarify what realistic expectations for the parties are. So you can tell people, okay, well, if you don't like this deal, we're going to take our chance in court. But you can't do that unless you have a benchmark. And until now, there wasn't one. And now there is. And turns out it's come out in favor of what the Palestinians have been saying all along. So the issue here is not that it obstructs negotiations, it's that it's leveled the playing field and made it a more even playing field for Israel compared to what we had during the Oslo Accords, which was a terrible deal, which was basically the idea of someone took your house and then offers you a room in it and charges you rent. So when they say Palestinians don't want peace, they're not offering peace, they're offering pieces.
Right, and I definitely want to get into the Oslo Accords later on. But before we progress into like the lawfare aspect of all of this, when people say there's no coercive force, there's this idea of this leveling the playing field. But there's this overriding kind of pessimism over the past 9 months that international law really doesn't mean anything. There's this massive double standard and hypocrisy. So now, in the simplest terms, now that this ruling has come forward, do you see this affecting anything going forward? Do you see this putting pressure on Israel to actually make change, or the Western governments that basically flout their virtuous adherence to the rules-based order changing in any ways? Because we're looking for performative effect. Like, yes, legally this does have a lot of weight, but do you see any performative effect happening because of this?
Yeah, I think I would start by challenging sort of the premise there in terms of one of the unfortunate functions of United States militarism and Israeli militarism is the effect that it has on its population. And it's sort of necessary to convince the population that they are unstoppable, that nothing stands in the way of their imperialistic might. And therefore, that no international institutions can hold them accountable. And to go back to what we mentioned before about lawfare, that includes delegitimizing international law. Now, it's very obvious, this is very obvious when it comes from the government, but as you mentioned, this pessimism, even those who are progressive are like, oh, international law doesn't do anything. But I would point out that's actually a very American perspective, because it's a very pessimistic perspective that comes from existing in a country where you're constantly bombarded with messages that international law is useless. And that's not just on the right, that's also on the left. It's useless. And I get it, because it comes from a sense of frustration that no one can stop the United States, because you're constantly being told no one can stop us. And so when you see that these international organizations aren't stopping genocide, you think, well, they're useless. And I would just really caution against that attitude, because what that necessarily assumes is that courts exist to prevent or halt crime. And that's not why they exist. That is a perspective that buys into this very carceral idea of enforcement, police, cops. And that's why I caution against it for those who are trying to, reinvigorate their radical imagination as what kind of better world can we live in, is that the aim is not enforcement. We shouldn't think of it that way, because if we're going to focus always on enforcement, we're always going to need cops, we're always going to need military, we're always going to need people doing the enforcing, which just makes the enjoyment of human rights for everyone harder. So I would first say that, we need to reset our attitudes a bit. The second thing I would say is that the use of the passive voice is very interesting, because we're always told it's not enforceable or it's non-binding, and it's reported on that, this doesn't have any teeth, as you mentioned, or it's not enforceable or it can't be enforced. And I would say that's the wrong way to put it, because if we're speaking technically, no court can enforce their own judgments. That's sort of the point of the separation of powers. The court makes the decision and then the state has to enforce it somehow. Or may not even be the state. It might be a private party who wins a civil claim. It might be the revenue service. So no court in the world can enforce its own judgment. So to say, well, this isn't, the ICJ doesn't have an army or the ICJ doesn't have a police force is a ridiculous thing to say, because no court does. And what it's meant to do is to take the focus off the fact that it's actually not about whether or not the decision is enforceable. The question is, who's supposed to be bound by it? And if we look at the UN Charter and we look at Article 94, the first thing that Article 94 says is that each member of the United Nations undertakes to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice. So by shifting the focus to, it's not enforceable, completely overlooks that actually any member state of the United Nations has a duty, first and foremost, to uphold it. So it's not the obligation of the court to enforce it. It's the obligation of the state to actually comply with it. And if they fail to do so, and this is a point that almost never gets mentioned in American and Israeli media, is that Article 94.2 of the UN Charter says that if they fail to do that, that the matter can be referred to the Security Council for additional measures. And then again, we hit this pessimism. People say, oh, well, the US is on the Security Council, they just vetoed. But the UN can do a lot of things. Bear in mind that the UN is not this homogenous, separate, supranational world government that it's often played off as being in conspiracy theories. It's a community of states. So in the same way that states have to find ways to reflect, the impact of judgments in their laws, so do the states. And there are so many mechanisms that exist other than enforcement with military and police. A major one is sanctions regimes. The UN has a sanctions regime. The Security Council can decide to list organizations as being sanctionable. They created a blacklist of organizations that were complicit in violating the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Israel. They also can order sanctions at Security Council level. And beyond that, I think we also need to look at the effect that this judgment has for all the countries around the world that aren't the US and Israel, that have domestic mechanisms that allow them to enforce the judgment. Because what we're talking about is genocide. We're talking about apartheid. These are international crimes, and they have a special status under international law, which says we recognize these crimes are so bad that anyone can basically take action to prevent them and enforce them. Any country has standing if nothing is being done about them.
That's an interesting point that I never hear it get brought up. It's like, okay, it's not enforced. The United States is not going to enforce it. Britain is not going to enforce it. But that doesn't mean other countries won't. And that's when we see this thrust towards pariah statehood and isolation that does take a long time. Like, the Olympics are coming up. South Africa couldn't participate in the Olympics for like 20 years. This isolation does take a long time to normalize, to mount, and, to, in some ways, formalize. So that's something that never gets brought up. And that's an interesting point to bear in mind going forward. And now I think at Harvard, you told me you were taught by a former IDF legal official. So I'm sure you have some like unique insights into how they wage this lawfare, as you were saying. And we can see that like some of these talking points, like it's not enforceable, are part of that. But it seems like from the layman's perspective that they make a bunch of sweeping statements about international law, which aren't necessarily true. And they do this in order to undermine the international humanitarian law system, thereby get away with whatever crimes that they want. So it seems like now that this ruling has come forward from the ICJ, that they are an occupation and that they are guilty of the crime of apartheid. The Western leaders are now kind of in this predicament where they support Israel no matter what. But if they continue on the status quo, they're just at risk of undermining publicly the entire rules-based order. And so I'm wondering, like, what your opinion is on that. Like, will they actually try to follow this ruling, or will they just obfuscate the situation more and kind of hem and haw and really not do anything, and thereby, underline the hypocrisy of Western values that's been going on for the next 9 months? Do you see this changing anything in terms of their stance?
That's a great question. I think there's a few things there that we should unpack. And the first one I want to address that you mentioned is this pariah state status. I think that's really important because when I mentioned before that, the UN can introduce sanctions and those sort of things. The only way for the US and Israel to sort of get out of having to comply with this judgment in some way, shape, or form is to pull out of the UN. And I just can't see the US doing that, because that would mean giving up their veto power on the Security Council. And if there's the only thing that, the US hates more than disagreeing with everyone else is being irrelevant. So I really doubt that they are going to do that. And I think you're going to see some fractures in the Israel-US relationship if it comes to, I think that the US government would rather throw the entire US population under the bus in the form of giving military support to Israel than pull out of the UN Security Council. I genuinely believe that, because you have to bear in mind that until very recently, international law was serving Israel and the US very well. And I think this is some of the blowback that we're seeing. So, one interesting point that keeps getting brought up a lot by Israel, and this is relevant to your point about, manipulating and twisting international law to undermine the rules-based order, is that the US and Israel both argue the same point, that it's sort of a violation of their sovereignty to have to follow international courts. that, they should have to, that their domestic courts uphold the rule of law, and these unelected governments in the, unelected judges in The Hague are making decisions for their countries, and that's, impugning their sovereignty, which, aside from being absolutely ridiculous statement in the context of international law, what's really interesting and fails to be mentioned is that there's a key principle of international law that says that in terms of the worst crimes, like apartheid, slavery, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, it used to be the case that it was just the state, of citizenship of the offender, and the state where the offences were committed. Only those two states would have jurisdiction. So again, it was the offender's citizenship and the state where the jurisdiction where it was committed. And that was because crimes were seen as being committed against the state. It was the people versus whoever. And there was a big shift in international law after the Second World War where the rights of victims were recognized. And they said, well, hang on, it doesn't matter what the nationality of the offender is. It doesn't matter where the crimes happened. If justice is for the victim, shouldn't it matter where the victims are from? And shouldn't it matter that, there's not impunity for these crimes? And so there's a principle basically that's enshrined in the Rome Statute, which says that the court has jurisdiction if the national court of a state party is unwilling or unable to prosecute the relevant individual. And that can be because the whole state has collapsed, or it can be because they're hawing and humming and, putting off actually holding their nationals accountable. And that's what you see in the United States, and that's what you see in Israel. So there's this principle that says, if a state is doing that, the international courts, their jurisdiction kicks in. And what's really interesting about that, Greg, is do you know where that principle comes from?
Not entirely, not
who
particularly.
Who invented that principle? It's the Israeli Supreme Court. And they invented that, spawned it, I suppose, in what's called the Ican case. It's called the Ican doctrine. And what happened was Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi who fled to South America, Argentina, I believe it was. And Argentina wouldn't prosecute him initially. And Israel said, we'll send him to us because, he was responsible for the murder of 6 million Jewish people. And Argentina said, well, he's not an Israeli national. And by the way, your state didn't exist when he committed the crimes. So you don't have jurisdiction. He didn't commit the crimes in Israel, and he's not an Israeli national. So what they did is they had Mossad go to Buenos Aires and kidnap him off the street and bring him back to Israel. And the Israeli Supreme Court basically decided, aside from saying that his extraordinary rendition was fine, which would absolutely not fly these days, the principle that has stood the test of time is what's now become the Ican doctrine, which says it doesn't matter if you're not the state, it's not just the state of the offender or the state where the crimes are committed that has jurisdiction. If we want to focus on the victims and the rights of victims and justice, we need to ensure that those responsible for the most heinous crimes are brought to justice. And therefore, if any state with jurisdiction is not able or willing to take action, the state of the victims can take action, even if the crimes weren't committed there. And so that was set up in order for Israel to try Nazi war criminals. And now it's kind of come back and hit them in the face because the same principle says that it doesn't matter if you don't recognize if the Palestine is a state, because the victims are Palestinian and Palestine is a state party to the ICC. So we have jurisdiction over you. And that is why Israel is throwing a temper tantrum right now. It's because the laws that they set up in order to prosecute the worst crimes against humanity committed during the Holocaust, turns out they apply universally.
The lack of a sense of irony is sometimes quite astounding. It should also be it's also worth bearing in mind that same principle was used to try to issue an arrest warrant in the ICC for Putin, if I'm not mistaken, for war crimes in Ukraine, even though Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute either. But, Western officials were really using that, flouting that as a casus belli to expand the war in Ukraine too. So, that's kind of where a lot of this, it's hopeful at the same time, but there's also this degree of pessimism that I mentioned
I think also, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, also if we can go back to Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor's remarks, he said that when he was investigating, he was told no, that the ICC is just for Africa and war criminals like Putin. I think another thing that what we're seeing that as much as there is pessimism, I actually have a lot of optimism for probably the first time in my international law career, because what we're seeing is we're seeing people from the global south, people who were living under apartheid, who are from colonized countries, who were brought up with the promise of Western human rights and Western ideals and believed them. And we're like, well, okay, you created these laws, you created these systems to benefit the West, by the way, but let's take you at your word and let's make them apply to everybody. And that's what we're seeing now. And that's why I think we're seeing this big, temper tantrum from the United States and Israel, is because they have created, the noose for their own neck, because they made these laws. They made international law. This has all been created since the end of the Second World War. This is all precedent that was created by, the US and Israel. And now the people who they sold the dream to, in their former colonies and in the global south are saying, okay, well, now we're going to hold you accountable. And I think that's incredible. I think that's an incredible thing to be excited about, to see South African lawyers, standing up for justice in the International Court of Justice. The ICC prosecutor that Israel spent 5 years harassing to drop the case, is from the smallest country in Africa. And she remains steadfast in her mission. And, I think this pessimism, this idea that international law is not effective or it's useless, I think this is very localized to countries like the US, where the government benefits from this idea that international law is not useful, because outside that context, people are very hopeful about international law, realistic about it's not going to save us, right? But it's just one tool. And the great thing about international law, the great thing about having international law standards, is that despite our religions, cultures, ethnicities, morals, ethics, it's a universal standard for everyone. So we can sort of, apply it everywhere. And I think ultimately that's what Israel and the US fear, is they fear it being applied to them. And that's certainly what we see from Israel. And, if I could just go back to the point that you mentioned about being binding and not enforceable, I always say with these things, as much as we become disillusioned with, the ability of these institutions to stop genocides or whatever, I would say look at Israel's behavior. Okay, so for example, Israel has spent 5 years and millions of dollars to get the head of Mossad to harass the ICC prosecutor not to investigate Israel. So my question to you and to all your listeners is, why would they do that if they didn't feel intimidated by the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court? There's something there that scares them, because otherwise, purely from an investment point of view, you can't justify that investment. There's some reason, because if they genuinely thought that these courts had no teeth, they had no power, they'd go, say what you want, we don't care. What's it got to do with us? But they don't. They are engaged in the system because they know that they have to be engaged in the system to have any form of legitimacy. So in order to have any form of legitimacy, they have to at least pretend to play by the rules. Right.
And so, I mean, when we speak of them being worried or concerned, when we look at their official press statement, it's the only one that we have so far. This really happened on Friday. We're recording this on Sunday. We might have something more on Monday, but they're probably going to go with this for a while. You can kind of like read the desperation in the language. It says it should be emphasized that this opinion is blatantly one-sided. It ignores the past. Well, of course, it ignores October 7th, but the historical rights of the state of Israel and the Jewish people in the land of Israel. They even refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, biblical names. It doesn't seem to be rooted in any sort of like hard law, like anything that they're referencing. It seems detached completely from the system that they apparently subscribe to, but also don't want to be a part of at all. And they are. It is noticeably, it's definably apparent that they are now finally concerned about this, and that that brings me to I think the third section was that that we talked about was that Netanyahu has spent his career promising that he will torch the Oslo Accords once and for all. And this has been a major talking point for Israeli propagandists, that they had this peace accord, that they were finally willing to come to the table with like the Palestinian state and the terrorists and Yasser Arafat after the first Intifada. And, you know, they came to the table, the Oslo Accords, which have always been a bad deal for Palestinians because there was the power dynamic was very one-sided. It was the Israelis essentially condescending to allow the Palestinians to have a shred of like self-determination. But now it seems, and Netanyahu's basically promised that throughout his political career that they will never come to fruition, that he will torch them. And now it seems that the ICJ, by ruling that Israel is an occupation of the land, they have an obligation to not occupy and be an apartheid state, and that they have a responsibility to deal with the Palestinians as like equal partners, essentially. It seems like the Oslo Accords are finally dead, just not in the way that the Israeli government wanted them to be dead.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like that, you know, that old story about the monkey paw, that you get a wish and it comes through twisted. So I suppose that's kind of true. And I think, as you say, you know, the Oslo Accords were a bad deal. And what we know works in terms of, you know, resolving these sort of complicated situations that are not all that complicated with Indigenous peoples. And this works all over the world. I think, you know, there was a Harvard study on this that basically said the only thing that works long-term sustainably is self-determination. That's the only thing that works. And you got to put the power in the hands of the people effectively. And that is not something that Netanyahu in particular has ever been prepared to do. And in fact, he incited violence against the only Israeli prime minister in recent times prepared to do that. And that man was assassinated, and is effectively why the Oslo Accords didn't go through. Not that the Palestinians weren't prepared for peace, that Israeli prime minister was shot by a right-wing Israeli. So, you know, it's a very creative interpretation of history, the idea that they weren't ready to accept the Oslo Accords. Well, no, they were. And then, you know, a right-wing zealot assassinated the prime minister that was brokering peace. And as I said to you earlier before, it's sort of like someone takes your house and kills your whole family, and you come, you know, you're on holiday and you miss it all, and you come home and there's some new people in your house and they're like, oh, sorry, you can have a room upstairs and we'll charge you rent. And we'll put up this little plaque that says your parents used to live here. It's insulting. Why would you accept that? Like, you have a right to the whole place. Like, it's this, to say that the Palestinians don't want peace. No, Palestinians want justice. And they have been very clear on the three things they wanted. They want the right of return. They want an end to the occupation. They want equal rights. And they're very clear. And, you know, let's be honest, when Israel says that Palestinians don't want peace, what they mean is Palestinians aren't prepared to compromise on those three things. And, you know, we've talked a lot throughout this sort of segment on pessimism, and I've tried to sort of inject some moments of optimism that I see. And I think, you know, even in this press release, it is a completely different tone. It is a huge shift in tone. And I have read like hundreds of Israeli press releases in my time, and they normally adopt a very aggressive, almost bullying tone in an attempt to, they use emotive language in an attempt to rally the international community around Israel because of this grave injustice that's happened. They invoke a lot of, you know, Holocaust language, you know, tomorrow is Holocaust Remembrance Day, or, you know, this is the biggest loss of life since the Holocaust. And this is a huge shift in tone. This has gone from like aggressive, bullying, emotive language intended to rally support to more logical and rational, albeit hollow language. And what I would like point out here to anyone who's, you know, looking at Israeli propaganda is, the first thing is, who is this for? Is you need to ask, who is this for, right? So it's from the foreign ministry, I think, the Foreign Office. So it's not for Israelis, okay? It's in English, so it's for the international community. And the language, the way it's written, you know, there's a sentence in there, there's like a whole paragraph. It's very European. So when I read this, as someone who, you know, works in Europe, who translates a lot of, you know, legal texts into more sort of Americanized language, this is a document that is written for a European audience. It is written for the European view of international law, which is one about negotiations and, you know, all coming to the table and so on. It's not about this aggressive approach. So I read this and I say, this is for Europe. And then I ask why. And my hypothesis for that is that what Netanyahu is scared of is EU sanctions. Because, you know, the US and Israel, again, like to paint this very bleak picture that everyone is with Israel and everyone supports the genocide. That's not true. And the EU itself, you've seen, you know, Spain and I believe Norway have come out wanting to recognize Palestinian statehood. Other countries have said, no, we won't, but we will listen to the UN. And so this is terrifying for Israel, because the way that the EU works, the way that the Europe keeps peace among each other is by subscribing to this supranational body, right? And they have a European court as well. So their European member states can't just say, oh, let's ignore the ICJ, because then all their other member states will say, you're going to ignore the European Commission too? You're going to ignore all our stuff? So this is terrifying for Israel in that sense, because now that we have a clear proclamation here, I think what we'll expect to see is the EU will have to do something. The EU will have to have sanctions, tariffs, whatever. So no more parties in Paris for Netanyahu. And, you know, as much as the US in particular loves to play this idea to its own audience that, you know, people would only ever want to come to the US, that is a terrifying prospect for someone like Netanyahu to be barred entirely from Europe. And as you said before, you know, really risks Israel becoming a pariah state.
And so finally, I think that's the big takeaway. It's like, I mean, for me, with no like legal expertise, it's like, okay, so it's non-binding, it's opinion, it's meaningless. But then why are you so scared? Because you can see the desperation in the language. Like every time they lash out, get more aggressive. They have their paid propagandists on like social media, just spreading these same talking points around. It's like, yeah, okay, well, you must be concerned. At the very least, you must be concerned about something. So the last point with the last 4 minutes we have here, I just wanted to get some clarification and see if this is an accurate read of things. That because the ICJ has ruled that that Israel is an apartheid state, its legal systems were basically designed to try Palestinians on a completely different level. I was just wondering if that means that they can no longer investigate themselves, because spokesperson Matt Miller loves to get in front of the White House press corps and say, well, we're waiting on Israel to investigate themselves when it comes to these crimes against Palestinians. Is that going to be a harder talking point to sell to the White House press corps going forward after this ruling?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, that's in the part. Practically, reality speaking, that's done. That's what the ICJ and the ICC have effectively tacitly said, because the ICC, for example, the ICC prosecutor, if we can use that as an example, they can't actually step in unless a state is unwilling or unable to prosecute. So they spent 5 years gathering evidence, and they basically concluded that Israel's not doing anything, that their courts are sluggish, and that, you know, justice delayed is justice denied. So there's this very weak refrain in that press release saying, you know, Israel has an independent and respected legal system. No, mate, you don't. The fact that the international courts have had to take action and have accepted the case, the very fact that they have accepted these cases is proof that they don't. You can't say you respect the rule of law because the international community says you don't. You can't say that your courts can decide for themselves because the international courts have said that they can't. So none of this really rings true. And, you know, to come back to something I said right at the beginning, and, you know, you're saying it's non-binding, you can't on the one hand say that this is going to obstruct peace efforts and then say it's non-binding. If it's non-binding, how will it obstruct anything? Okay, so either it's non-binding and doesn't matter, or it's binding and obstructs peace efforts. It can't be both, right? So it can't be both. And I would finally just point out, you know, as my final point, one of the points that they like to talk about a lot is Hamas. Hamas is going to take over. Hamas. You know, there's a recent poll that came out of Palestine by an organization on the ground there. And they are actually doing live wartime polling. And they found that of literally Gazans fleeing Gaza, said that basically after the war, if there is an after it, only 4% of people would want Hamas to rule. And the majority wanted the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority were the ones that asked for this advisory opinion from the ICJ. So again, you can sort of see the picture coming into a bit more clarity. It's a bit more terrifying for Israel. It's the idea of a viable Palestinian state. They don't want Hamas to rule. They want the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has this legal opinion that says, yes, it is apartheid. Yes, it is an occupation. And now they can negotiate from that position of strength. And again, that's why we saw last week, Israel came out and passed a motion saying that they're not going to recognize Palestinian statehood. That's what this is all about, really. They're trying to make the prospects of a Palestinian state unviable, and Netanyahu has always said that.
And now we've kind of passed an event horizon where, the more they try to suppress it, the more people are going to be behind it. It just doesn't seem like it's going to lose any momentum anytime soon. So,
no.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Kristen Zornada. This has been a excellent discussion. I don't think a lot of these points that you've made have really been shared. Definitely not in the mainstream media. So we appreciate you coming on to State of Play on Mint Press News tonight to talk with us about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me on, Greg.
All right. Well, that was a very enlightening interview with Kristen Zornada. I really enjoyed the irony of the Eichmann doctrine because, that's exactly what's being enacted here. So, yes, I think that is basically a wrap. Let's get into the Q&A. We're kind of running 3 minutes late. I'll probably extend the episode another 3 minutes because definitely wanted to explore that subject in depth. So let's jump into questions and see what is up. So what earlier, if you're just hopping on, I mentioned Iran not wanting to escalate and Israel not wanting to escalate. So we think that the Houthi Israel counterstrike that happened over the weekend to kind of fizzle out because, again, as much bluster as the IDF and the far right ministers in the Knesset say, they actually don't want an escalation because their air defense systems are not up to snuff. We've seen that with Hezbollah hitting Iron Dome batteries. We've seen that with Houthis striking just Tel Aviv recently. So they feel very insecure. They don't want to escalate. Iran is, I think, Seppo Mari on Twitter says, what political goals is Iran achieving with this? Well, that's an expansive subject. But some bullet points are they want to be recognized as a global player. They've been sanctioned to death, but actually, well, what we thought would be death, but actually the sanctions from the West have made Iran stronger. They're rebelling, they're becoming a player on the global stage. They want to be able to, through proxies, defeat their main antagonist and adversary in the region, which is the Israeli state. But they don't really need to escalate the conflict to accomplish those goals. And guess what's bad? They've spent so long trying to build up their economy from the sanctions that they don't want an escalation, which would be bad for their economy. They could end up having their major financial and industrial centers bombed. So, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for them to escalate the conflict. The United States doesn't want to either because we're trying to shift to East Asia, and plus we're still bogged down in the Ukraine, and the American people will not accept another forever war in the Middle East. So it's gonna chill out, and then Iran's just gonna bide its time because it doesn't really need to do anything because the ICJ has just ruled against Israel, and that's going to start choking it off. It's going to have its own sanction package oriented towards Israel this time. So there's really no reason for an escalation from their perspective. They're doing just fine as it is. Next question. Here it is. This one. Greg Stoker, like Matt Kennard. I think, Matt Kennard, he founded The Intercept. Is that the correct? I'm not that familiar with him. Our crackpots. Thanks, John Jones. From what I've heard, they say quietly socialist decoys, saying just enough to attract socialists. Mint Press News, not to be trusted. Well, first of all, I'm not necessarily a socialist. I'm a very vocal black flag anarchist, and the black flag is the negation of all nationhoods and nation states. So I think nationalism is the worst thing to ever happen. So that's kind of my stance. I don't really get into the socialism, communism thing, but there is intersection between people who are anti-genocide and people who are not. So yeah, we're gonna have socialists in the big umbrella that believes that child slaughter is wrong. But a crackpot, I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty reasonable most of the time. So, why? Okay, so why is Israel triggered if it's non-binding? Well, again, there's a misapprehension of what non-binding means. So Kristen definitely talked about this in the segment, but just because it's non-binding, just because there's not going to be an army that comes in to enforce it, doesn't mean there won't be very real consequences going forward. The process of normalizing isolation of Israel is actually terrifying to them. So yeah, sure, it's non-binding. They're not going to send in like a coalition force to make Israel not be an apartheid state, but it does have very serious consequences going forward. All right, what else do we have? What does this do? What does the ICJ ruling do for a country that is constantly bombarded by bunker busters? We tried to give a hopeful spin on this because it is hopeful, and it's not really a spin. It's a sign that the frustratingly slow gears of international law are finally starting to turn. As I said in the beginning of this episode, this ruling will not do anything for the lived experiences of Palestinians in the short term. So this is a long-term victory. Short term, it's not going to do anything immediately. It's not going to stop the violence. Laws have never stopped violence, unfortunately. So, all right, Wednesday, we the people have got to do something about this war criminal Bibi Netanyahu when he speaks to the U.S. Congress on Wednesday, the 24th. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be with Veterans for Peace covering that. I might be speaking to the press alongside Colonel Larry Wilkerson. You guys might know him. He's a pretty prolific on YouTube and other social media platforms as a geopolitical commentator and analyst. He was the former chief of staff for Colin Powell during the unfortunate years. And now he's also a member of Veterans for Peace. And so, yeah, we're going to be, I think he's going to be there. I'm not sure, but I'm going to be with Veterans for Peace. And then there might be some direct action stuff that gets real spicy, and I'll be live streaming that and covering that as well. So if you are a vet, we're bringing OCPs if you still have your own combat fatigues, and if you're not too fat to fit in them, that's what we're in. So jeans, uniform is jeans on the bottom, fatigues on the top. If you can still fit into them. Mine, they're a little tight, but I can still get them on. So yeah, that's Wednesday. I'm going down to DC tomorrow. I'm getting to DC tomorrow, not on Wednesday, because he's going to speak to Congress, and Congress goes into session at 9 a.m. So I don't want to have to like travel last minute to try to get there for any actions that happen on the ground. So the night before, and then I'm coming back the 24th. So that's just my logistical plan. I recommend that if you're going to DC, you get there on the 23rd, if possible. So, yes, is it okay? All right. Do you think that the Balfour Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, completely and irreparably messed up the Middle Eastern borders? No, I mean that was Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot after the First World War. It was when all the arbitrary countries. I mean, the Balfour Accord was business as usual. Just the British Mandate of Palestine. But after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, it was the Sykes-Picot that really did it. So you guys should look into that if you're more interested. I heard the PLA and the UN requested the ICJ ruling. Well, so first of all, this is a good thing to reiterate. There is a difference between the ICC case and the International Criminal Court against Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and then three leaders of Hamas. The South African genocide case in the ICJ and this case in the ICJ. So there's a difference between the genocide case and the Israel occupation case. We're talking about the Israel occupation case right now, right? This case has been in the works for like 5 years. It was started at the request of the UN General Assembly, because the ICJ is attached to the United Nations. The UN asked for a ruling by the ICJ on Israel's occupation and apartheid in Palestine. It took years now, and it was done independently before the events of October 7th, and it's now finally coming to fruition years later, because these things take a long time. So yes, it was requested by Palestine. The UN then requested it after a special commission brought it to the attention of the General Assembly. General Assembly asked for a referral to the ICJ. The ICJ came back with an opinion, and now we don't have enough time to get into what it's going to look like going forward in the UN, but it'll probably come down to Security Council resolution. And how do you think the United States is going to vote? If they abstain, it'll be really interesting. I think Kristen also talked about this in the segment as well. Okay. Finally, we've got, yes, but what about security? I think this is for the protest. I want to show up. So how can we all meet up? Well, the thing that sucks is I'm pretty sure I'm like maybe monitored. I don't really even use Signal. So I'm just there to film and live stream because I draw a lot of attention. So when it comes to security, Signal with disappearing messages, but bear in mind, even Signal, the app, can be cracked. So anything's crackable for sure. Nothing's secure unless it's like old school. Because if your adversary is high tech, you go low tech. So word of mouth, probably and you'll be able to find something on the ground. Just show up early, ask questions, get in touch with people. That's how I'm doing it, because I'm kind of like security kryptonite because I'm a public figure. So I'm not involved in any of that, but I will be there to record and document. And we're talking about the protests in DC on the 24th. Netanyahu apparently just landed in DC, so it's going to happen. All right, guys. Well, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for watching. This is State of Play Men Press News. We wanted to cover the ICJ ruling because we knew the mainstream media was never going to cover it. And because they never covered it, it just kind of goes to show, well, it's probably significant. Yeah, that's just how it goes. If the mainstream media, the corporate media doesn't cover something, it's probably because it's important and they don't want you to know about it. So thank you all so much for watching. We hope to see you on the next one. This will be posted to YouTube and I think Twitter as well, or sorry, X, if you want to watch a replay. And we'd appreciate it if you like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want to support Mint Press News and support non-corporate media, you can always check us out on Patreon. Throw $5 this way towards Mint Press News instead of, to The Economist. So consider that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on Thursday. I will probably be doing an episode exclusively on all the things surrounding the protests on Wednesday. So hope to see you then. And let us know in the comments if this 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time works better than the old 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So cheers, y'all. See ya.